Hello, my name is James Sennett, and I'm a professor in the School of Business at Brunel. My specialty is business ethics, which is why I bring the topic I bring today. Where in the world does business ethics fit in? Globalization and corporate social responsibility. Now, of course, this subtitle immediately raises two big questions, and we will address them to start with. Question number one, what is globalization? Now, by globalization, I am not simply referring to import-export exchanges. Such interaction among nations has been going on in business for millennia, of course. But by globalization, I am referring to that highly complex integration of businesses around the world, which is a phenomenon of the latter part of the 20th century and the early decades of the 21st century. It is now commonplace for large businesses to own and operate or contract with businesses in many different countries around the globe. What is corporate social responsibility? Well, the first answer to that question is that it's perhaps the hottest buzzword going in business ethics over the last couple of decades. It's so hot, in fact, it's even got its own acronym, CSR. That's a lot shorter and a lot easier to say, so I'm going to go with it. The best way to explain CSR is to relate it to two other hot business ethics topics. The first of these is corporate citizenship. This is the view that businesses are citizens of the community in which they reside. Like all citizens, they reap benefits from their community in the form of government and civic services, opportunities to exercise influence in community actions, etc. They also have obligations to the community like citizens. They pay taxes, adhere to applicable laws, regulations, and ordinances, etc. So it follows that corporations also have a responsibility for the well-being of the community, just like human citizens have. They need to be good neighbors. They need to be mindful of the effects on the community any of their actions might have. And those effects should play a significant role in a business's decision making. The second hot topic is sustainability. In 1987, the UN Commission on Environment and Development defined sustainability as, quote, the capacity to meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. In other words, it is the effort to live our lives fully without damaging the chances of our children and grandchildren to live their lives fully. These two concepts together support a full and robust definition of CSR. In fact, I now define CSR for my classes as fulfillment of corporate citizenship duties in ways that are consistent with sustainability. So what happens when CSR meets globalization? Where in the world does business ethics fit in? A very common and understandable first response to this question is one of caution, or even skepticism. After all, different nations and cultures in different parts of the world often, in fact commonly, display a great deal of variety and many times disagreement in terms of what is morally acceptable behavior. A very common attitude is one of cultural relativism, the belief that what is morally right or wrong differs, and sometimes dramatically, from culture to culture. There are no absolute moral principles that apply across all cultures. However, the consensus of ethicists working on global ethics issues is that cultural relativism is a myth. Let me try to show you that cultural relativism is not true. In fact, hardly anyone really believes it is. The toy industry giant Hasbro has published a list of global business ethics principles that they operate under in their international business dealings. These principles include a prohibition on forced labor and child labor, fairness in assignment of wages and benefits, ensuring workplace health and safety, communication of all principles and policies to employees and others affected by them, and many more. Now, I think it's safe to say that we all agree strongly with these principles. In fact, I would dare to say that we would consider it morally unacceptable for any business from any country in any conditions to operate in violation of these principles. Now, as soon as you make that judgment about any culture other than your own, then you have announced that you are not a cultural relativist. Cultural relativism is the denial of any universally applicable moral principles. So as soon as you acknowledge the existence of even one, you have denied the doctrine. So with a simple list of guidelines for organizational behavior, Hasbro has tricked us all into denying a very popular view, especially popular among academics, by the way. What does Hasbro know that we don't? Just what are they on to? Well, we'll start our answer to this question with the seminal work by ethicists Thomas Donaldson and Thomas Dunfee. Donaldson and Dunfee have identified what they call core human values, or hypernorms. These are moral norms that, in Donaldson's words, constitute the absolute moral threshold over which no moral decision can cross. Donaldson offers as examples of these values respect for human dignity, respect for basic rights, and good citizenship. He does not claim that this list is exhaustive, but it is certainly enough to be illustrative and to engender significant dialogue, none of which we have time for in the present. I want to compare the work of Donaldson and Dunfee with the work of another great business ethicist, and perhaps my favorite pedagogue on the subject, Joseph Desjardins. Desjardins introduces what he calls the primary goods. He calls them this because he sees them to be necessary to achieve any other legitimate goods one might wish to attain in life. Desjardins identifies three such primary goods: autonomy, rationality, and mental, physical, and social well-being. Now, rationality requires a quick explanation. By rationality, Desjardins means that we need to have access to any information necessary to make fully autonomous decisions. Think about the concept of informed voluntary consent for medical ethics. Rationality is the informed part. Autonomy is the voluntary part. A combination of Donaldson and Desjardins' lists is a great first approximation of a working list of hypernorms, moral standards that are appropriate to apply in any moral decision making in any culture in the world. The obviousness of these hypernorms is, I think, a big reason why I found this poster on the Rights 365 website. The heading reads, "Cultural relativism can never justify the violation of human rights." In other words, respect for human rights is a universally applicable, absolute moral principle. In other words, cultural relativism is false. Donaldson uses hypernorms as the starting point for his three guiding principles for global ethics. The first principle is respect for hypernorms. The second is respect for local traditions. He's talking here about what he and Dunfee have called legitimate norms. These are cultural rules, customs, expectations, etc., that conflict with the moral sensibilities of other cultures, but are nonetheless consistent with the hypernorms. The third principle is an understanding that context matters in moral decision making. I really wish we had time to talk about this one, but we must move on. So, finally, let's go back to our examples of Hasbro's principles and ask our question. What does Hasbro know that we don't? I think that they are aware of the concept of hypernorms and are adopting policies that are, in their estimation, necessary to the upholding of those hypernorms. Prohibition of forced and child labor is in service to Donaldson's basic rights and Desjardins' well-being. Fairness in wages and benefits lives out the principles of human dignity and well-being. Ensuring safety is a textbook case of care for well-being. Communication of principles and policies is necessitated by autonomy and rationality. And on and on. Hasbro's principles adhere to the hypernorms and primary goods we have named. So where in the world does business ethics fit in? Right here, in the identification, analysis, application, and adjudication of the hypernorms in cross-cultural business activities. Thank you very much for your attention.